Hi, and welcome to the Blurry Turtle Podcast. Today's podcast sponsor is that bottom part of the bag where the pistachios start to win. Should you get something to crack it open? Is there even a pistachio in there? Ha ha! You'll never know because you've been defeated by pistachios. So, just a quick recap of the US Open. Would have thrown this up a bit sooner, but I've been asleep from Sunday till now. Another great match at Wimbledon, another classic Alcaraz-Sinner clash. Maybe Alcaraz looked a little flat in this one, but I think that was just from the level of Sinner. One big theme I think in the match was Alcaraz having a tough day on serve. He was at 53% for the day. That's, it's hard to win on grass when you're below 60% really, especially against a good returner like Sinner. The question of was it a bad day or was it pressure from Sinner's returning? It's probably a bit of both. Carlos had a bunch of double faults also at moments that just kind of allowed Sinner to get interested in some service games. There were some spots where he was holding much easier, but those tended to be when he was down a break already. I wonder if the mild frustration and impatience in those moments kind of makes him play a bit freer and more in his real style. He does like to just go for his shots, and I think the more he's thinking about what's technically correct on a play, the more he kind of is a little outside his comfort zone. In any event, it just felt like Sinner had at least 2 games every set where Alcaraz looked vulnerable on serve, and he took advantage of that. With any high-profile matchup, I think a handful of big points are going to swing the match. And Sinner, I think, won the match because he played the break points he faced extremely well. A lot of second serves he had on break points, and he just never really dropped his level. He didn't try to go too big. He was willing to spin the ball in and play a rally, and he was solid in those rallies. They were the moments where things fall apart, and, he held his nerve. I think he challenged Alcaraz to hit highlight shots to win. That was really the approach here. And that still involves a powerful level of ball striking and a solid amount of shot making. I just think Alcaraz looked, again, a tiny bit flat at times. We can partially chalk that up to the surface. On clay, when Sinner leans into a shot, Alcaraz is able to time it well enough to infuse, pace of his own. At Roland Garros, it felt like Sinner was rushed when they were trading power on the backhand and forehand. In Wimbledon, it feels like Sinner leaning into his shots made Alcaraz unable to get a full swing. When you're looking to create depth with a shorter swing, you tend to give up control. If you're following this week's tournaments, Navone and Cerundolo was a spot like that. Cerundolo was just putting a little bit more on the ball, and Navone just wasn't able to get out of those patterns. On grass, obviously the ball sliding and taking errant bounces definitely makes Sinner's average shots more effective. And I think that was the difference. On clay, he had to really produce, visible offense to score. And on grass, every single one of his shots, when he strikes them well, is a threat to score. Add in, Sinner got 2 or 3 extremely timely net cords, and it just felt like a lot of very minor things went his way here. And, I think it could have gone 5 easily, but, credit to him for putting in the work and staying mentally strong against an opponent he'd been struggling with. He reversed that result, and it changes the shape of the rivalry now. Especially since, outlasting Alcaraz has not worked out for him so well. So trying to do it again here, the right tactic, I think, for him, but, it probably took a lot of nerve to plan it out that way again. It's a treacherous path trying to outlast Alcaraz. I think it is something Sinner's learning to manage better. One of the issues I'm seeing in this matchup is that Sinner tends to play very conservative and not give up much. He keeps the ball in places you can't really create angles, tries to keep the ball low, doesn't give you a lot of full swings. It's a good strategy because of Sinner's rally tolerance and because he makes fewer errors than Alcaraz. But the results, I think, tend to be cyclical. He'll thrive, make things difficult in the beginning, but as he plays more and more conservative, I think he gets a bit predictable. I think when he looks to avoid errors for longer stretches, it slowly kind of nerfs his game. By the second set, Sinner was playing so careful that he almost started to baby the ball in. There were a few shots, one forehand slice Alcaraz hit in particular, that the ball took a tough bounce, but Sinner was going up to hit it kind of the way, I'm not going to say something negative, but it just looked very hesitant, very tentative. And I think when you get in that pattern of, trying to never miss, it winds up putting the pressure back on yourself. So it's something I'm sure his team is keeping an eye on. You want to stifle your opponent and give them nothing, but, as you lull them to sleep, you also want to throw some punches of your own. I don't actually know if you guys can see brightness on my screen. I'm also not really showing you anything of interest, but if you care about Hugo Grenier and Crawford, you're having a great time, so you're welcome. I actually would point, that possum style, looking to drag guys out is good. I think you need to bring something with it as well. You need to, infuse pace at times. I actually think Brooksby and Medjedovic are two guys that do that really well. They'll play possum in rallies. When the other guy forces something or tries to create an angle, that's when they'll infuse pace, and jump on them. They make it tricky to really go for shots against, because that they can come up with something like that. Obviously, Sinner can. It's just a matter of knowing when. Despite that gradual lapse, Sinner really did open up as the match went on. I think in Roland Garros, he may have gotten a bit excited near the finish line. But, in Wimbledon, he stayed composed until he was forced to go for broke, I think having huge offense and a stable base as a backup helped him late in the match. Jannik was serving for the third set, and Alcaraz basically put him in 3 ridiculously bad positions. And, Sinner came up with 3 huge shots. So for me, I had almost forgotten at that point that he could take risks. But it's a dynamic of his game that makes him really dangerous. It's a huge result. I think it makes the U.S. Open a lot more exciting. And I think it'll be a closer match, honestly, than Wimbledon, even though Jannik won last year, because I think Alcaraz will be able to time the hole a bit better there. He's not, at his best on hard court, obviously, but uniform surfaces give you a little better timing. And Alcaraz, I think, hits the ball harder there than he did in that finals. Obviously, hard court is Jannik's best surface, and this was just one match on grass, but I just think the conditions at the U.S. Open are good for Alcaraz here. The weather in New York has been really, really hot and humid, so good chance that Alcaraz's physicality, will make him really hard to beat there. Heading into Wimbledon, I felt like Sinner needed to win. Now things shift a bit. I know it's strange, if he's 1-5 in the last 6 matches, shouldn't feel like Alcaraz needs to win, but if Alcaraz can back up his U.S. Open title and then win the Australian Open, which is pretty likely, the Australian Open, then, by Roland Garros, it starts to look like Alcaraz needs to win. And given how close the finals was there, sorry, there's going to be a lot of pressure. So it's a lot of projection, but it'll be interesting to see how Carlos responds here to being the underdog for a short period. Past few seasons, I think, in North America, he's been coming in after the Wimbledon title, and he's just played really free, not totally committed to the suggested strategy of keeping the ball in the court. Not bad play. Obviously, he's still won a ton of matches, but, he's dropped sets and a few matches to guys who didn't really earn them. He just played free. Maybe his team told him, look, you won the big title, have fun, or maybe that's how they're treating him developing his game on hard court. I can't say exactly what it is. I don't actually believe some of the issues. You can say he has some timing issues with the way he swings on his forehand, but I think when he locks in, he's able to play much more solid. So it's interesting to me, I think, to see how he grinds in these lead-up events, how many he plays and whether he tries to win them. And, obviously it's not just a choice. A lot of players are much better on hard court. There's, more danger, but I think it's interesting. The men's U.S. Open, obviously there are more threats. There are guys, like Shelton, Draper, Zverev. Probably not Zverev because he's dumb. But, there's just a lot of guys that... Sorry, Zverev. But not sorry. Yeah, I don't know. Some people I like talk shit about them so often that it feels like a reflex. And then after a while, it starts to feel bad. Like I shouldn't, Like I didn't start out disliking people. I just kind of over time felt like their behavior was something I didn't really want to align myself with, But I guess if I kind of adopt bad behavior, like I'm doing the same thing, I don't know. If I meet him, I'll probably hit him, but I don't think I hate him. Or maybe I do. You don't care. I don't care either. Just a quick note. I watched Fritz's press conference. Speaking of guys I used to hate on, and I kind of hated it because he gave a really good account of the match. He's gained a lot of maturity and had some really good perspective on where he's at versus the top guys, and also what his optimal strategy is against them. I felt like when he lost to Alcaraz, just a lot of unfortunate errors. He'd get a ball to swing at, not really a setup, but something where he had a full swing, and he'd try to pull the trigger at the first opportunity, and just, I don't think the shots were wrong, but he missed a lot of them. It made things easy on Alcaraz. If Alcaraz can just defend, he's going to beat you every time because he's good at that and he enjoys it. He loves to make gets and play that style. So the reporter asked him basically if he thought he should have maintained a base level and looked for some errors from Alcaraz, because that can happen. I thought Fritz had some good insight. He said basically, even though he knows that's there, it's only there temporarily. And he would know, he's on tour, he's playing these guys all the time. So while steady, can win, he feels like Carlos will quickly adjust. If you're just looking to make him make errors, he said basically Alcaraz will start to really take very small chances, basically. Just kind of work the point, put in a little extra on each shot, and just kind of, test you, it's not a situation I think Fritz wants to be in. So nice to see him putting a lot of thought into tactics, and aiming high. Accepting a loss, but feeling like you had the optimal strategy it sounds silly because you still lost, but it's probably the right way to approach things when you have some physical limitations like him. So it feels like he's a lot more seasoned than he used to be, and being that level-headed, it will keep you at the top of the game for a long time. He'll probably have a good North American swing. It's a guy who I thought him getting in the top 10 was a sign that the men's tour was getting a little weak, but no, he's really kind of backed it up. On the women's side, kind of a rough final. I'm not going to go too far into it because there's just not a ton to talk about. I think, yeah, she got zipped, but I don't think it really matters in the context of trying to win the match. It matters in the context if if you're betting on yourself plus 11 and a half games, it matters, but that's not what these players are doing. They're trying to win matches. They're not worrying about the score or the totals or anything like that. I think, had Anisimova known the goal was to avoid getting zipped, she could have won a game or two in the first set, but she was looking to find range and get control of the match back, so the errors don't really matter too much. Like in some respects, 3-0, 4-0 is the same equation against Iga. It's not a serving battle completely, so you're trying to overcome a big problem at that point. You're losing a ton of the baseline rallies, and you're losing them because you're not getting time. So if you're not able to buy time in baseline rallies by hitting big, you're kind of cooked. So if Anisimova has one route to get through there, it's rushing Iga. So she kind of just has to keep going for it. Obviously, as the score compounds and it starts to be a thing of get a game rather than try to win the match, you're just going to get tenser and tenser. I thought she handled it well. It's hard to get zipped, and everybody's making a bigger deal about it than I think it really is. But Anisimova seemed pretty mature about it. It sets up a really good U.S. Open. I think Swiatek winning. I think if Sabalenka or Rybakina or one of the other big servers win, it kind of, you go into the U.S. Open thinking that it's just going to be another server winning that. Here, Swiatek, because she won it before, because she's been working so hard, and because of the fatigue aspect of the U.S. Open, it's interesting. A lot of players at this point in the tour they're tired. A lot of them have minor injuries. It's hard to grind. Plus, the weaker players in terms of ranking, they have to grind out the whole North American swing to try to get points. They're thinking about staying, where they're ranked for next year. It leaves things open for Swiatek to really train and hone in for the U.S. Open. And, given that it's going to be hot, given that it's going to be difficult conditions, it's a scary thing to see her playing well. The women's tour is always shifting. I think that the U.S. Open has a bunch of high-profile players probably at their best. Swiatek, obviously. I do think the U.S. Open, her offense is not going to be quite as effective because the opposing players can change direction better. You get a lot of bonus on grass just from players, having trouble moving as well as they can. Hard court has a lot of really efficient baseliners, who are just going to be a tough out. Players like Pegula, players like Paolini, just players that, Swiatek probably looks like she has a bigger game than them, but on hard court it's just not an easy way to score on them. Sabalenka obviously is going to be hungry. Probably will time the ball better on a uniform surface. I think seeing her play on grass and clay gives you the idea that she's, back to errors. And there was, of course, a major implosion in Roland Garros, but I think on hard court that goes away. She has been way more professional the past season and a half. Obviously, Madison Keys, always a threat. Winning a major at the Australian Open gives her the rest of the year to basically free roll. She's not under pressure. She can play free. I don't know if she's 100% physically, but she did okay in Wimbledon. Pegula's playing solid. These courts are really good for flat hitters, so her game should be there. Andreeva, Mira Andreeva is, Erica Andreeva is good too, but Mira Andreeva continues to improve. I think that's the point there, is that she's not winning these big titles, but she does seem to get better in every single one, and she doesn't really fold when the pressure's there. She's had some really crushing losses too, which I think just gives her experience, Obviously, golf with the home crowd is a problem. A lot of talk about her forehand and serve issues, but, that's why she loses. And this is a player who's been in the top 5 for a long time. She doesn't lose that often. So when those things work, she's able to beat anyone, honestly. Her serve, when you see her serve an ace, you wonder why she doesn't have, 5 majors already. I don't think Anisimova in the heat is going to take the title. But 2 out of 3 formats, she's a big factor in the draw. She can beat anyone, and obviously the U.S. Open, she's playing at home. She's from Jersey. It's local. Zhang is another dangerous floater, and maybe Paolini is the last one I'd circle in that second tier, just because in hot conditions she might be able to outlast people. New York City is had the hottest summer it ever has so far. So really interesting. Just want to run through some nuggets from the draw when I was looking through it. Nothing too exciting here, but looking back, I think Dimitrov's level looks even more impressive. Not that he was going to win the tournament, but to do that to Sinner when it seems like no one really has. The last time Sinner really got soundly beaten, I'd say, was that one set against Tommy Paul in that tournament where Sinner was zipping people and then randomly dropped a set like 6-1 to Tommy Paul. So that was more about Sinner missing than anything, and for Dimitrov, obviously Sinner's arm was heavily compromised in that match, but it looked like Dimitrov had a real shot to win. It doesn't mean he's going to come back and win titles. He's always been good, never really beat the top guys, but it is a moment I'm sure even Sinner was running her about, after he wins the tournament, like, oh, I got a bit lucky there. Offner, I thought, got his game back to tour level. He's at like 141 in the rankings right now, so if he plays well in the next few events, he can probably get back on tour. For him, I think he avoiding qualifying for the Australian Open next season would be ideal, because he really does play, at times to the level of his opponent. He has the offense to beat tour level guys, but his movement isn't that great. So at the challenger level, it's tough to grind. He did lose a match at the challenger level, I think, this week. Shelton, kind of assuming that Berrettini spot of the guy who's not quite at the big 3 level, but has that offensive talent to compete. And, the ability to win most 3 out of 5 matches where he's the favorite. You're not seeing him crash out of the draw in strange ways. He's basically getting to the guys who are winning the tournament every time. So that'll keep getting him closer and closer. I know he's 0 and whatever against, this player. I know he's struggling against that guy, hasn't won a set, but the sets are close, so that means a lot. I think he has more physical ability too than Berrettini, so that future is bright. The issues with his backhand are the same. It's just not up to the same level of the big 3 right now, but I think it'll be a lot easier for him to compete against Alcaraz and Sinner on hard court, and playing at home at the U.S. Open is where he does his best work. It's kind of like Tiafoe. They're able to show up in those moments, and it's 2 players who really play for the crowd, so it should be good. Fucsovics managed to get back in the top 100. Interesting to see if he can hide his backhand in the North American swing. That's the big issue with this. He has a great backhand, and the slice is really nice. It just feels like he can't score with it, so it makes him do a lot of running, and hard to stay in that top 100. So interesting to see if he can. I think he needs some points, is what I'm saying, basically, on this hard court season. Cilic, had a great tournament. He seems to still have the ability to elevate in a big moment, which is interesting because he's been grinding challengers And, he's been playing great there, but he's also had some tough losses. So it seems like it's a focus thing for him. The more he bounces the ball, the better he is. Him beating Draper will have a lot of scrutiny on him. And on Draper, that is, and on Cilic, I guess. Anyone who plays Cilic right now is going to be nervous. Ultra hot conditions are good for a server. They're not exactly what favored Draper historically, but he's been working on his fitness, so the U.S. Open will be interesting. I don't know with Draper, he had such a good clay season and that wasn't expected. And it feels like he might have just been a bit physically flat. Like, even though he's fixed his stamina, he's not used to playing months and months in a row where he's healthy. It's just, it's a new thing for him. So interesting. I did think Cilic played well, but I thought Draper also seemed a bit flat at Wimbledon. So those are two guys to kind of peer at. Whatever Arnaldi had, this is a complete segue, but whatever Arnaldi had that was making him play tremendously clutch tennis for a few seasons appears to have been borrowed by Flavio Cabali. With Cabali's spot serving being his best attribute, I think, he can have a good hard court season also. He's just playing well right now. He had a finals run in Washington last year, so it's possible he has another good run. It's hard to back up those points on hard court. He's not the guy you'd expect to just consistently make the finals of hard court tournaments. So a lot of pressure there, but, he's playing well. The Wimbledon points give him a big boost. So, possibly he has a really good summer. Another bright point, Austin Holmgren. He'd been grinding the Challenger Tour for a long time, and that might be over. He's huge serve, great power. He's at 146 in the rankings now, so he has a chance to kind of continue this climb. The qualifying run was impressive, but, outdueling Halise, Macek, and giving De Minaur a good fight is really promising stuff. So he's also at the semis of a Challenger right now, so it appears there's really no hangover there as far as his desire. That's good to see people working, after they get a big check. Majrzak's career seems back on. Same as Fucsovics, though, I feel like his quality play still leaves him vulnerable at the lower levels. I think he just doesn't hit the ball big enough to win unless he's playing perfect baseline tennis. So another guy who really needs to keep going. He just losing a challenger this week. I think it was Clay, though. So not a disaster, but, it's a guy who's appeared and needs to keep working. Maybe the last note, Fonseca. Seems like it's clear now he's going to fare better on faster surfaces in his early career. So interesting to see how he plays on hard court. He definitely is entertaining, which is one of the reasons why I keep watching him. He's just goes for shots and plays hard. Pretty mediocre clay swing. I think people were expecting, or I was expecting him to, maybe snag a small title or make a semifinal, and just didn't happen at all. Pretty much lost to, most of the stronger players he played. Played well at Wimbledon. I think it's clear his offense is just way beyond his defense at this point. And, early on, his losses were to stamina on clay, to just stronger players with their adult strength already. So interesting to see what his team does as far as fitness as he goes forward, how he works in the off season. In the women's draw, Solana Sierra had, one of the biggest results, the kind that changes your career. Fourth round at a major is 329,000. That moves her up to 67th in the rankings. That's a new career high. She's unlikely to drop down for a while too, because she's gonna rack up on other surfaces. Grass is not even supposed to be her best. Her best surface is supposed to be clay. So it's a big boost to her. That lets her open up her game a little, I think, and play. When you're a young player, you want to stay on tour, so you tend to play a bit more careful. But here she can open up, and she does hit the ball hard. So interesting player. She did get overshadowed by one round, but I want to mention Kristina Buksha. That was a great tournament for her. She lost in a third to Sierra, but she beat Vekic along the way. And Buksha is showing, when her consistency pans out, she's going to be excellent. The offensive pressure is really there. Some players, I'm jumping through these things quick without segue. I just have bullet points here, but there's sometimes players who kind of outperform their notoriety, and it's funny to watch it shift. I think Danilovic has been qualifying and threatening upsets for a few seasons, and now it's almost expected. I thought she'd just do well because she does well. She's so good at going uphill. I think she'll just keep going, and it's hard to do that forever. She had a tough one against Madison Keys, and interesting to see how she kind of handles the expectations going forward. Players do tend to compete well against you once you're a known commodity, once they can gain something by beating you, or even just, the hater within us all. You just want to beat that player that seems overrated to you, or they have that hype train going, and you just feel like, no, it could be me. It should be me. Galfi had a good tournament. She stuck just off tour most of the time, but, a game or two away from beating Anisimova. If she can iron out her length and keep training, she can probably stay on tour. Just a very exciting player. It's hard for those players who are really big hitters to just play well all the time. It takes a lot out of you. Pavlyuchenkova is a good example of that. She can still ball. Being a veteran at a major is just a really useful spot. She just seems like she's still, moving solid, playing great. So, good to see. Maybe Navarro and Buzas Monero, the last two I'd point at. Navarro obviously didn't do a ton. She's already taken some crushing losses in her career, but she's improved every season. So that's one reason I'm still kind of looking at her to keep going. Because early on, when she was getting wild cards, and I think it was Charleston, it didn't really look like she'd even become a fixture on tour. So given how much her game has changed and how much she's improved, I think there's a chance that keeps going. It's another player like, Pegula, who, they have all the advantages, but they seem to be working independent of that. They seem to want to get better at tennis, even though they could do nothing and be fine. So last one, Buzas Monero, who just, it seems like, the bigger the stage, the tougher the opponent, the better she plays. Really interesting stuff from her this week. It seems like she just situationally competes. And that's more of a mental thing. She's obviously great at tennis, but it's a mental thing to stay composed against a good player and just execute your game, and her game works. So, she came on the tour with Basil's Rivera, and I kind of thought Rivera was a bit better, but Monero's doing great. That's pretty much it for U.S. Open notes. Just take a look at the stuff, the stuff from this week. Real quick, this week has been pretty decent. I think the 250s after a major are pretty much chaos. The top guys seem indifferent to sticking around. Whoever does, it feels like whichever seed actually wins their first match says, F it, I'll stay and try to get the title. The local standouts and qualifiers always do extremely well, a ton of upsets. A big chunk of that, I think, is them participating in the biggest match of the year, of their year, while the top 100 opponent is a bit burnt from a major and, heading to North America for 3 months in a week. You can go get early training. I think also a lot of players will skip these events to spend extra time with family. If they're from Europe or Asia, that region, you can be sure if players are losing early, they might head home for a few extra days as well. These guys are traveling the whole year. So if they have family or they want to spend time with friends, this is the week they'll probably do it. So it's a good week, for lower tier players to get some points, get some cash, and that helps them travel, helps them, go to qualifiers and stay on the Challenger Tour. So it's good stuff. Seems like this week, Cerundolo has decided to stay. It's a good win against Jumer. Bastad is super slow, so most of the big offenses got outlasted early in the tournament, but Francisco seems locked in. He was down 2-1 against Navone and looking lackluster, seemed like he'd just leave, and then seemed like he just decided he might want to win. It has to be frustrating for these guys like Navone to be up against players who have the match almost entirely in their control. Once Cerundolo starts hitting hard, Navone just couldn't maintain depth, couldn't change the tempo of the rallies. It just looked like he was trying to outlast him. And, when you're not hitting the ball deep or with much weight, it's hard to really make the other guy miss on a slow court, So Navone turned into, pure defense, and Cerundolo is one of the few guys on tour with the power to hit through the court in Bastad. He plays Darderi next. They've had a few close matches in the past, so good Cerundolo tends to put together really quick starts to matches, and Darderi's issue has been having to wait out big offenses, so not entirely sure how that'll go in the second set. I think Cerundolo could win the first, obviously. Darderi's near his best right now, so I don't think there's any result that's too wild. Darderi just beat Baez 0-2, so clearly he's playing fairly well. Baez has been a bit flat lately, but still good result. The other side of the draw is Carabelli against De Jong. This is a completely necessary result, I think, for Carabelli. He'd been just losing constantly, had some tough draws, looked flat out there. Him and Garin got into it a bit, little frosted mini beef at the net. So it's pretty clear he's feeling a bit stressed and back against the wall type stuff. Gstaad is at altitude pretty quick. I think it's near the water. So it's a good spot for servers. A lot of them went there. If you look at the draws of the two tournaments, a lot of the grinders went to Bastad. A lot of the servers went to Gstaad. 3 servers in the semis, Bublik, Kazo, and Booz. I might be pronouncing that one wrong. Booz is playing excellent. Has JM Cerundolo next, who's basically not really a server. He's looking to drag everyone into extended rallies. It's Francisco's brother. He's lefty. Plays with a lot of variety. Interesting kind of a flat serve. Just a really impressive player to be able to do what he's done on faster clay too, and to beat Casper Ruud, gives him a shot against Booz. Booz has been, at the 250 level mostly, playing a lot of challengers. He has a good serve. He's a righty. Good serve, good offense, nice skill. He's competing well this week. Also, I think, Ruud is definitely a big win. I'm not sure how near his best level he is. He skipped the grass season, not really having the Casper Ruud year that you might expect. So, Kazo and Bublik, Kazo easily could have bounced out to Basilashvili in round 1. Basilashvili looked kind of like he ate some fish that disagreed with him. I don't know if he's not really training or, I don't know, just strange puffiness to him right now. But Kazo's ad serve was excellent. He's just hitting a kick serve, flat backhand down the line after it, and it's basically just keeping him in this tournament because from that side, you just can't stop him. He's putting people in the bleachers and then painting the line. It's, something that's going to be interesting to watch against Bublik, because Bublik's not really a defensive wizard, so I wonder, what tactic he goes with from there. Romania, pretty much going how you'd expect. The Romanian players were the highest seeds there. Avanesian was there, but she hasn't been winning. Begu is playing great. Christian looks like she's kind of primed for the title. Kristea plays Teichmann. She should win. Teichmann was down a set and a break multiple times against Bulgaro in the first round, and Bulgaro just couldn't close it out. Teichmann's purely a baseliner, so, she's looking to outlast Kristea. So if Kristea is playing well, this is a must-win for her. She's not having the best season, so this is a good spot. Just to note, Bulgaro's a player I really liked initially. She can hit big forehands on the run without needing much balance. Moves well. Just seems like so far she can't really find the balance of offense to defense, so unforced errors are just costing her these matches. She did have, she had a bunch of match points. So it's just, sorry, not match points, but, the opportunity to serve for it. So just a rough one. Match points, I'd say, I don't know if anyone saw Pellegrino Greek Sport in round 2, but Pellegrino had 5 match points. It was just really hard to watch. Really hard to watch him, lose those, because honestly, Greek Sport hit the baseline on the majority of them. Hamburg. Where are you, Hamburg? Yeah, some cool stuff there. Louise Boisson is backing up her French Open result and, playing really solid. Tomova was really good today, and Boisson just executed. The athleticism is solid, but the skill level and tactics just seem really high quality. So plays Yastremska next, and that should be really good. Bondar, I think, won that tournament before. So cool to see her, thriving there too. Anyway, I just wanted to throw something up. I know I said I'd do a recap, so, there it is. Later.